I'm really pleased now to hand over to the chair for this morning's, this first panel session, my colleague Inaya Folarin Iman, who is the head of events at Civic Future, but is also a journalist and a broadcaster. And she's also the founder and director of the Equiano project, which, if you don't know it, Google it now and find it. It's a great initiative to promote free speech and an open dialogue on moral and cultural questions of the day. So Inaya is going to chair this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So this opening session is what is the national interest? And some of the key questions we want to explore is sovereignty in the nation state, a debate and discussion that's been very pertinent in the UK over the last few years. But also, what are the kinds of things that constrain public leaders and whether or not these things can be overcome? There's been lots of discussion about whether that's international law, the markets, climate change agreements. What are the things, if there are things, that are outside of political leaders' control? And how can they overcome those things? Because if the democratic demand is for particular things to change, and there is a sense that it is not possible to do those things, then that creates problems for political leaders. So we have brought together a very distinguished panel to explore this question from many different areas. What are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about? What is the national interest? Or should we be thinking even beyond that type of questioning? So we have Yascha Mounk. He is a writer and academic, and his work really focuses on the crisis of democracy and the defense of philosophical liberal values. He's professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, and he is the author of several books, most recently The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time. We're also delighted to be joined by Elisabeth Braw. She's a foreign policy analyst. She is a senior fellow and author of a number of books, including, again, most recently, Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. So that speaks to some of the themes that we're going to be talking about. And sadly, we have had a last-minute speaker change. Rado, due to unforeseen circumstances, couldn't join us this morning, but I'm really excited and very thankful that Phil Mullan has stepped in. And he is a writer and business manager who researches and lectures on economic, demographic, and business issues. And he has also written a number of books, including most recently Beyond Confrontation, Globalists, Nationalists, and Their Discontent. And also Benedict Macon-Cooney. He is the Chief Policy Strategist at the Tony Blair Institute, and he has a particular interest in economic and fiscal policy, health, climate and energy, science, tech, government innovation, and geopolitics. So these are some of the themes that we are going to be exploring. So each of our speakers are going to give 5 to 7 minute opening provocations. We're going to have a chaired discussion, and we're going to then open it up to the floor, and we'll take a few questions at a time, so please feel free to think about what you would like to ask. So we are going to start with you, Yascha.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having here. It's a real pleasure. I'm looking at the title of this conference as a whole, The New World West, Progress in an Age of Disorder. Now, I'm a little bit jet-lagged, so I stayed up to watch the American presidential debate yesterday. And disorder is indeed the name of the day. So just for a little bit of context for these remarks, my prediction as of a few hours ago is that Joe Biden will not be the 2024 Democratic nominee for president. I think that has become basically impossible after yesterday's debate. And that means that America is in a deep, deep mess. And the likelihood that Donald Trump is going to be the next president again has gone up significantly. So all of it does frame significant disorder and should frame real reflection about what the national interest of Britain consists in. I want to make a general conceptual point about how to think about the national interest and then briefly say something about Britain. So the general point is that we live at a time when there's two very contrasting ideas about the national interest that are gaining power in politics. One of these is the conception of people like Donald Trump, of authoritarian populists who want to claim that the national interest is a zero-sum game, that the only way to advance the national interest for one country is in zero-sum negotiations or zero-sum conflicts with another country, that my win has to be and has to entail your loss. And so if countries adopt that kind of conception of a national interest, it makes it very hard to have any form of meaningful international cooperation, and it greatly increases the risk of conflict in the international system. On the other side, I think you have an ascendant ideology on parts of the left that really thinks about the key set of groups in society as not being the nation in any significant way, but subnational groups based on sexual, gender, and ethnic identity. And to them, the concept of national interest is in itself suspect. When we talk about national interest to them, we are simply talking about the wrong thing. The only thing that is legitimate is the interest of those kind of communities, and in fact, the nation itself should be understood, as King Charles said last fall, as merely a community of communities. So that, I think, defines the idea of a national interest out of existence to all intents and purposes. As a philosophical liberal, I want to defend the idea of a national interest that is not zero-sum and that doesn't have to be at odds with the interests of the citizens within a nation, of an idea of a national interest which is to create the conditions for a free and prosperous society, in which, of course, the interests of the United Kingdom will sometimes conflict with the interests of Germany or of Ireland or of the United States, but in which these countries recognize that there is an awful lot of cooperation that is possible and in fact required to create the conditions for that free and prosperous life within the country. And that, I think, is the notion of a national interest that liberals should defend. Now let me say something a little bit more specific about Britain. I feel a little bit odd talking about British national interest since I'm not a British national. But perhaps I can just share my very brief and provocative thoughts on where Britain stands, which is that in many ways Britain, I think, is the most impressive country in Europe. It is a country with a permanent seat in the Security Council, one of the 1.5 armies in Europe that actually count for something, that has still tremendous financial power in the city, that is a genuine global center of culture, that is capable of influencing global culture in a meaningful way. London probably remains the only true world city in Europe, with a possible competition of Paris or Istanbul, but neither of those quite count for various reasons. So this is a country that has tremendous strengths, and of course, having gone to university here, one of the strengths are universities like the one where we're at in the intellectual community in this country. At the same time, I think that there is something to Britain that is always striking to me as a visitor, which is that the moment you step outside of London, the moment you step outside of the top universities, outside of the big companies, there's just an ineluctable crumminess to the country. There's something about the condition of housing in this country, the condition of many services in this country, the way in which a lot of the population feels cut off from the national life, the way in which GDP per capita is quite high, but actually the lives of people at the 30th percentile or the 50th percentile of the income distribution compare, I think, quite unfavorably to places like France or Germany. That to me is always quite shocking in Britain. And so I think if you want to sustain popular consent for the kind of liberal notion of a national interest that I hope Britain will pursue, you need to build on the strengths of this country, but also remedy what to me are its striking weaknesses. Thanks.
Thank you. Now to Elisabeth.
Yeah, so when I saw the title, I was reminded of a story that Helmut Schmidt told. I'm sure everybody remembers Helmut Schmidt. And he, in an interview after he had left politics, sorry? Okay. Well, Helmut Schmidt, famous West German chancellor and strategic thinker, he recalled in his interview how in 1977 the government of Iran wanted to buy a stake in Daimler-Benz, and Daimler-Benz, as Helmut Schmidt noted in this interview, was the crown jewel of German manufacturing. And Helmut Schmidt said the following, and I said to myself, the Ayatollah is waiting in Paris, it can't be that a revolutionary government owns a stake in the crown jewel of German manufacturing. So what did Helmut Schmidt do? Does anybody remember this story? No.
Carry on. No Helmut Schmidt fans in the audience.
So Helmut Schmidt called up Deutsche Bank, the CEO of Deutsche Bank, which at that point was really a German bank. Now it's obviously an international bank, but it was a German bank. He called up Deutsche Bank and said, the CEO of Deutsche Bank, and said, you have to buy this stake. You may not make money on it straight away, and you may never make money on it, but it's your patriotic duty. And what did Deutsche Bank do?
They bought it.
They bought it. And because it was in the national interest. And I've been thinking, since we live in a completely different era where, for example, Deutsche Bank is completely globalized and I think has had a string of various non-German CEOs, as have most other leading companies, I've been thinking about if Rishi Sunak, if Olaf Scholz, if Emmanuel Macron, if Joe Biden were to call up one of these CEOs and say, you have to do this, you have to do that, whether it's buying a stake in a strategic company or performing any other act that is in the national interest, would they do it? And would they? Show of hands, would they do it? Yes. How many people think they would? 2, 3, 4. Yeah, and so that is where the point at which we have arrived when it comes to thinking about the national interest. Who is responsible for thinking about the national interest? Is it just politicians? And if it's not just politicians, who else is it? Is it business leaders as well? And under which conditions should they care about the national interest? Is it citizens as well? And a good reminder of that is what happened last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, again relating to Iran, but that's just coincidental. 2 weeks ago, Sweden negotiated the release of 2 Swedish citizens, including one who works as an EU diplomat, the release of 2 Swedish citizens from Iranian jail in exchange for an Iranian, a convicted war criminal, Iranian who was serving a prison sentence in Sweden. That was a very heavy price to pay for a government, including like that of Sweden. And yet, the Swedish government felt they had to release this man in order to get its 2 nationals back who were being held unfairly, but nevertheless they were being held and Sweden wanted them back. We have seen the same thing with Brittany Griner, whose release was achieved in return for the release of Victor Bout, and we have seen it with various other cases of hostage diplomacy. So it's not in the national interest to release very dangerous people who are incarcerated in Western countries because they have committed certain crimes, but yet we do it because we need to get our citizens out. What does that have to do with the national interest? It has to do with the national interest as it relates to individual citizens. Do we, as citizens of liberal democracies, do we have a responsibility to act in the national interest in the same way that politicians do? And again, do business leaders have a responsibility to act in the national interest? And then, if we decide that we all have a responsibility to act in the national interest, what is the national interest? Who identifies what we should stand for and what we collectively, or maybe just parts of society, should work towards and defend? And I think this is where there is massive confusion, because we have had 3.5 decades of really extreme liberty, extreme freedom, including the freedom to travel wherever we like, to pursue our own happiness, to, by the way, forget our nationalities. We have had a roving global tribe of business leaders who may not ever have considered acting like the CEO of Deutsche Bank did in 1977, or was it 1978? And so, how do we then arrive at a point where we identify what the national interest is and who should act in that national interest? And by the way, who should conduct the education of wider society through which we can arrive at a point where we decide what the national interest is? And that will be a long process. And it's so easy to glorify the Cold War and say, well, during the Cold War we had it neatly organized and we knew what we were doing. But it's much easier to identify the national interest when there is a clear threat facing your country, and indeed an existential threat. And that may be where we are heading. And so it's in no way good that we have very powerful countries that wish to harm us, but the presence of these countries and the threats they pose to us may actually serve to clarify our thinking in our countries about what our national interest is and who should be responsible, who is responsible for pursuing that national interest. And I'm not sure whether I'm over 5 or 7 minutes, but I think I'll hand over that, Inaya.
Thank you. No, very interesting thoughts, and we'll come back to many of them. Now we'll hand over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Inaya. I agree. I think this question, for me, is especially pertinent because for many years, especially in official circles, there's been a lot of doubt expressed, if not derision attached, to the concept of a national interest, especially in the context of an interconnected, globalized world. And indeed, I think one of the most damaging legacies of the 30-year focus on globalization has been the hold of this outlook in which many in leadership seem to loathe all things which are national. I think for many years, globalists, the elites, sneered at anyone upholding the importance of the nation state, of national borders, and of the national interest as being somehow anachronistic, parochial, and sometimes even indicative of a racist, xenophobic outlook. Picking up on Yascha's latest book on identity politics, I think the way that academic, cultural, political institutions have all yielded, I think, to the divisiveness of identitarian politics. I think the telltale irony, as he alluded to, is that the one identity that these activists refuse to promote is the national identity. Unlike celebrating all those identities of an increasing number of minorities, national identities are perceived by many so-called progressives as a far-right obsession. And as in many other areas today, far-right is not a political description, it's a term of abuse. When you call people extreme right, far-right, it's a way of saying your views are illegitimate and deserve contempt, if not ostracism. Julie Burchill, I think, noted well in a column last week that just about the only time patriotism is acceptable in this country is during international football tournaments. And she warned people that continuing to display the St. George's flag when the Euros are over, which, as we know, may not be all that long in the future, then you can be fingered as an extreme nationalist and fascist. My argument is that identifying with one's nation, advocating the national interest, doesn't imply promoting the autarkic, isolationist policies that Yascha mentioned, policies like protectionism. I think, on the contrary, in my opinion, the national interest is best served by national, democratic internationalism. Now, a lot of cosmopolitans would see this phrase as oxymoronic, denying that you can identify with one's nation and be an internationalist at the same time. But on the contrary, I think a government cannot be truly internationalist unless it has a strong grasp of its nation, of its history, its values, and of its interests. It also needs, I think, to relearn the diplomatic statecraft that has been eroded in recent decades, but maybe that'll be something we cover in another session. I think what passes for internationalism now is generally having cozy chats with other like-minded leaders at various international forums. Or, on the contrary, it descends into demonizing governments that they disagree with, like China's. Instead, I believe that an internationalism that genuinely advances national interest should embrace 3 principles. First, the principle of democracy. Second, the principle of freedom. And third, the principle of sovereignty. First, the principle of popular democracy at home. I think that's because that, very simply, is the only way that national elites can earn the legitimacy to pursue their country's national interest on a world stage. I think that's self-evident, fairly straightforward. Second, freedom of trade. In that sense, I'm a bit old-fashioned because for me, with very, very limited exceptions, an unrestricted and an extensive international division of labour is the best thing for economic development and prosperity, both nationally and globally. And in contrast, I think the recent rehabilitation of protectionist policies over the past couple of years, I think Martin Wolf last week, a couple of weeks, saying we've now gone to the stage where we're all protectionists now. I think that shift is counter to the national interest. Protectionism is a backward economic and geopolitical step that damages national welfare. That's a conventional argument. But today, protectionism doesn't only do its traditional harm by inciting retaliatory measures, by pushing up consumer prices at home. I think it also extends decades of state manipulation and distortion of economic activity that, whether intended or not, have acted to sustain the existing muddling through and quite unproductive businesses which dominate our business network. And that, I think, has become one of the biggest blocks on creative change and faster innovation. I think that will be picked up again in a later session. And the third principle, finally, is respect for national sovereignty. I think this is not only a just approach to foreign policy, but entails that countries should engage diplomatically with all political regimes, including those with opposing, even abhorrent values, as long as those other countries also respect others' national sovereignty. This means not vilifying and boycotting nations because their leaders pursue repugnant values and practices at home. We can and we should openly say what we disagree with about another country's internal regime, whether it's the Iranian theocracy or the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party. But contravening its national sovereignty with any form of warfare is not legitimate. And practically, it usually makes things worse for that country's citizens. But crucially, this third principle also includes the right to actively oppose governments, such as Putin's, who do invade other nations and who do violate others' national sovereignty. And one final point, and very relevant today, I think. Any claims by a government to honour national sovereignty are rather hollow unless it exercises sovereignty in its domestic affairs. I think today's mainstream political class, for too long, has avoided abandoning, or has been evading, the duties of government, and I think it has to abandon that. It's been a behaviour that's been evident, I think, also in this election campaign in Britain, where the old parties have mostly skirted around the big issues of addressing productivity stagnation and of addressing Britain's role in the world post-Brexit. As elected representatives, politicians must stop hiding from their responsibilities. And that means reassuming the powers that they've outsourced over the years to expert bureaucrats and technocrats like the Bank of England, like the Office of Budget Responsibility. It means cutting out all the phony subservience to globalist institutions, which they use as excuses, I think, for not governing. And I think that's a falsehood which has been well illustrated by what's not changed since Britain left the European Union. Our governments, pre-Brexit, used to shirk their responsibilities behind the Brussels excuse, blaming EU membership as preventing them pursuing some policies or as having to implement others. But outside EU structures for the past 4 years, governments, I think, have shown themselves to be as incapable as it previously was in helping to take on the big issues of stagnation and energising economic growth, or doing much else that its people deserve and need in the form of providing effective public goods. Indeed, I think a core benefit of Brexit is that it has closed down one excuse for policy evasion, though, of course, others still remain, whether it's the legacy of the pandemic, whether it's Putin's barbarism, or whether it's China's industrial policies. In the past, pursuing the national interest required political courage from our leaders. And I think instead, for too long, we've been handicapped by the cowardice of politicians, unable, as shown in this election, even to have a grown-up conversation with the electorate as grown-up people, as grown-ups who can handle hard economic and political truths and can also be part of solving the national problems in the national interest.
Thank you, Phil. Over to you, Benedict.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think my comments might dovetail quite nicely with your finishing point, because I'm a simple but practical man, and I feel like we have debated many psychodramas and issues around sort of concepts of national interest, etc., for many years now, much at the price of a simple focus on what we actually need to do as a nation. And the single big world event that is happening around us today is AI and the technology revolution, which is profoundly changing the world, and which the UK has a huge role to play, potentially. But as long as we begin to reform our institutions and actually focus on the right issues rather than continue to debate different forms of conservatism, I don't mean this in sort of the big C sense, but just in the sense that we are not moving towards any form of progress. And the way that I look at this is, I mean, the current election campaign is a good example of this, where we are sort of duping the voters by not really actually putting any of these big issues onto the table. And if you look at what's happening around the world, if we talk about the US and state power and some of the giants today, two companies in the US alone, Microsoft and Google, have invested in $100 billion worth of supercomputers. Companies such as Nvidia are worth $3 trillion today. Microsoft, Apple, all the same are, which is pretty much the same as the UK's GDP. And if we don't move quickly to begin to actually get towards this sort of progress, I think much of these questions about what is the UK's role in the world and what is its national interest will become reasonably defunct, because we will have very little power, not least to execute national prosperity, but also in that sort of global stage. And maybe sort of some of these globalist institutions are holding us back, but at the same time we have no influence on much of the global stage today because of our sort of erosion of our core sort of national interest of, i.e. science, technology, economic progress, growth, and actually money in people's pockets. So the last 17 years, basically less than 1% of economic growth, the highest tax burden since 1950, basically unsustainable debt, and we'll continue with eroding public services, increased taxes, increased debt, and actually then worse outcomes unless we do something about it. And if I could think of anything that was sort of greater in the national interest, it was maybe beginning to solve that so people don't continue to pay more tax and actually get better services and growth. So I think there's a number of issues that we can begin to tackle around this. I think number one is actually a deep reform of the state. I don't think the state is fit for the modern era in any sort of feasible fashion. I think if you look at sort of the history of the British state, obviously the sort of the first expansion happens in the sort of post-industrial revolution as technology changes the world around you. You have the conception of the Labour Party, employment laws, etc. Second World War, expansion of the welfare state, and then you begin to get that big state which we really have today, and the NHS, of course, as part of that. You have the privatisation in the 80s, then the sort of the third wave with Tony and the liberalisation of both sort of social and market melding. But you haven't really seen any real fundamental change since that sort of 1944 concept of the big state. And I think if you begin to deploy technology into public service delivery, you begin to think about how you reform our institutions in deep and profound ways, not only can you massively reduce the cost of government, but you can improve the outcomes. On top of that, I think Phil's completely right. Government needs to get out of the way of a lot of the private sector as well and provide the foundations for this. I think if you look at, again, something like where we are with AI regulation today, I think we're in a relatively good place because we've pursued some pro-innovation policies, and I think there will be a fundamental sort of question over the next couple of years on what we begin to do there. I think it would be a mistake if we begin to go too hard, and actually we need to use some of our regulatory freedoms post sort of Brexit to begin to drive that economic prosperity and growth. But there are other levers that the state can pull. If you look at what's happening around other areas like France, since Mistral, it's trying to build state champions. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are investing massively in this kind of infrastructure as well. Somewhere like Singapore, with its sort of relatively enlightened leadership of high state capacity as well and high private sector growth, is going fast on this. And I think this is the primary question for the UK. How do we stimulate that economic growth? How do we drive industries of the future? How do we actually begin to build superstar companies rather than just sort of sort of, just the ones that just sort of begin to fire up a little bit, get bought out by the US, or just fizzle out because they don't have that ability to scale and grow. So I think this is the primary challenge in the way that you then drive economic growth and prosperity and get money across people's pockets across the country.
Thank you. Okay, so lots of thoughts to come back to. I'm going to go to you, Yascha. You mentioned that there is the zero-sum game, presumably on the right, and then there is the identity politics game on some sections of the left. And I think some people argue, isn't there like a tension within liberal thought that you have to tolerate certain ideologies that may well be illiberal, but actually that toleration in and of itself essentially allows free reign for particular ideologies to dominate, because within being a liberal itself, it is relatively relaxed about diversity of opinion. So essentially, how do you square that tension as a liberal, trying to stand up for a much more robust liberalism, but also negotiate those seemingly growing polarizing differences within ideologies in society?
Thanks, Inaya. That's a great question. I think there's two attempts at the moment to suggest that the core of a liberal project is incoherent. One of them comes from the left and often invokes, in a way that I think mostly misinterprets him, Karl Popper, and his paradox of tolerance. So there the idea is, yes, we want a tolerant society, but if we allow intolerant people to do what they want, then we're going to overthrow liberal society. And so there's something incoherent about tolerance towards the intolerant. What we should actually do is to censor the intolerant and sort of get rid of them. I think this relies on a deliberate ambiguity between two different meanings of tolerate. Nobody believes that we should tolerate, illiberal terrorist groups. Nobody believes that we should tolerate people storming parliament with weapons in order to overthrow a tolerant government. But that is different from saying we have a right, therefore, to censor what people are going to say. So I think there's an answer to the supposed paradox of tolerance, which is that, of course, you need to allow in a free society people to say things that you find deeply offensive, and to say perhaps even things that call in some sense for the overthrow of that society. But you're not in any way obliged, in fact, you mustn't, allow them to actually attack those liberal institutions in a concrete way. And that's a very straightforward distinction. There's going to be hard cases, but the basic distinction is very, very straightforward. And so I think we have to push back against these very common invocations of a paradox of tolerance on the one end. But I think on the other end, on the post-liberal right, among thinkers like Adrian Vermeule and others that have gotten popular in the last years, there's a suggestion that liberalism is actually constraining in a different way, that it claims to be neutral towards different kind of conceptions of how to lead your life, and therefore give you the freedom to choose what kind of life you want to pursue. But in reality, it favors the life of sort of maximizing your own autonomy and living a certain kind of secular life over various forms of more religiously inspired lives or more traditionalist lives. And there, I think there's a fair critique towards certain government actions and regulations that have been put in place in the last year. It's a fair critique towards how some liberals talk about the ideology. But again, I think it is just fundamentally wrong about what liberalism aspires to, and even fundamentally wrong about the overall sense of our societies. Because in liberal societies, much more than in any competitor regimes, you are able to be deeply devout in a society that's pretty secular. It's telling that when you push people like Adrian Vermeule and Sohrab Ahmari and so on to actually come up with examples of where it is supposedly impossible in the United States or in Britain or elsewhere to live in a way that is deeply inspired by religious faith, they always struggle to come up with very convincing examples because there really aren't that many. And so I would say that, that conception of a liberal society in which you actually have a lot of tolerance for people who are intolerant You give them the space to be part of society, even if you dislike them, even if you argue against them. And you certainly have a lot of respect for people who have very different notions of how to lead their lives, is perfectly compatible with liberal principles in a way that these two sets of critics would deny.
Interesting. So, Elisabeth, you were talking about how, how do we construct the national interest in relation to individuals, private companies, politicians, who decides? What are your thoughts when the population at large, for example, what their sensibility of what the national interest is different from what the majority of elites might think? So take the issue of Brexit, or even something more recently in the UK like immigration. There has seemed to have been, over the last 20, 30 years, a kind of sensibility amongst the public that immigration needed to come down. But amongst the elites, there was, even though ostensibly they may have kind of given credence to that argument, they felt that for a range of economic and other interests, that was a good thing. So how do we negotiate that, and how do we bridge a line between that type of tension?
We do it by interacting with one another, and I wonder if the sort of agora that used to exist in places like workmen's clubs, churches, those sort of institutions, they are clearly not as important as they used to be. In fact, they play a much smaller role, and even negligible role. So what are the new fora in which people can congregate in smaller or larger groups and exchange ideas? And the deterioration of our ability to articulate the national interest, I think, began with the bowling alone phenomenon, and it's not just in America; it's in every Western country. And if we don't bowl alone in the wide, if we bowl alone in the wider sense, yes, we can have a very fulfilled life, but it will be a life in which we exist within our groups, and even as atomized individuals with very little interaction, meaningful interaction with anybody. So where is our interaction going to take place? It's not going to be workmen's clubs. It's not going to be churches. What is it going to be? I've come to the conclusion maybe marathons are the new bowling clubs, because there you actually get all kinds of people, and they do interact, and they do run together, and they do have conversations. So maybe marathons will save us. But beyond marathons, what are the new institutions in which different groups within our society will be able to come together? And without that, we face what I think is already becoming a very strong trend in America, including in my husband's previously very harmonious hometown in Michigan, of deterioration of the social glue, and as a result, an increasing degree of ungovernability. Yes, that is the word. And that is in nobody's interest. Even if we have disagreements about what the national interest is, having a country that is becoming ungovernable is in nobody's, I think would be saluted by nobody. So what are those new institutions? Maybe they don't even exist in our societies yet. Maybe they still have to be thought up beyond marathons, obviously. And that's where I'll be very keen to see what comes up. Will it be related to work? Will it be related to, it can't be related to ideology, but maybe to religion, to charity. That's where I think we will see more development, because it should have become painfully clear to everybody that existing as a isolated or separated communities within a country doesn't result in us being a country. It results in us being just separate communities, and that is clearly in nobody's interest.
Yeah. May I just interject for one very brief second, which is, I like Robert Putnam's work a lot, and I think he's right about the decline of social connection in the United States. I've always hated the title of that book, Bowling Alone. I swear to you, you can can go to as many bowling alleys in the United States as you like. You will never find somebody who's bowling alone. So the book should have been called, Bowling by Text Message rather than Bowling by League or something. Anyway, sorry about that.
But Yascha, if I may interrupt you, so isn't the point that the bowling clubs that you used to have, where I could bowl with you even though we disagree about everything else, and are from different ages and different persuasions. Otherwise, you and I could bowl together and have a good time. So I've sung in choirs all my life. Choirs fulfill their function, but they too are on the decline. So sorry to be negative, but there's got to be something to replace choirs, bowling clubs, etc.
The places of kind of social solidarity where you're not just in your isolated, atomized.
And I agree with that. I just don't like the book title.
Phil.
Leaving the titles aside.
Singing alone.
I think rather than try and conjure up, new institutions, and then we got this, what's it called, the Saturday morning 5 kilometre or the park runs, and I think that's probably the example you're referring to here, which does bring a lot of people together. But I think when we look at the reality of this atomization that you describe, and there are lots and lots of different drivers of that, from deindustrialization and the collapse of the old industries and so on. But I think we should start with Joel's point, which he concluded on last night, which I think is it illustrates that this is not some sort of innate human, fragmentation that is going on for, humanistic reasons, but is the problems from on top. Joel ended with saying the problem, or one of the big problems, is the loss of confidence and the loss of faith in Western values, or the values of one's country. And I think when you have those in leadership, and I don't just mean in Westminster, but the leadership of our existing institutions, the cultural institutions, the academic institutions, and business institutions as well, who have lost faith in what their nation is about, who do not share a sense of trying to socialize the next generation into what they are part of. I think that is what has created this sort of lack of community. So I think the responsibility has to go on top, and the way in which we're living through a period in which many young people who, I can have lots and lots of arguments with, but I don't blame them as individuals, but they've been socialized in a way not to embrace the national values. And that encourages that atomization and fragmentation, and is now expressing itself, perhaps we'll come on to this later, in the fact that there is real polarization in societies in the West. The European elections and what's coming up in France this week and next week, that is a real new form of polarization which is going on, which has opportunities in it, but it's also can be very dangerous. And I think it's a matter of where we place the responsibility for that.
Well, just on that point, Phil, because I think, it has been understandably quite critical of the development over the last kind of 20, 30, 40 years. But actually, in many ways, isn't it a success or an achievement that we have a much more expanded, highly mobile section of the population that can travel, live and work and feel relatively at home in lots of different parts of the world, and that is almost a kind of success of the way that the world used to be much more insular and divided by various different national identities. And actually, a lot of people, maybe some also in this room, that feel quite sad about the rise of a lot of these movements that are demanding the re-institutionalization of various different borders and emphasis on national identity and all of these things. Actually, a lot of people feel that it was a sign of progress that we had the changes that we had. So what do you say to those? Like, do you see it as just solely all bad?
No, you're talking about the changes that people can move across borders,
but
or
even
the changes that people can travel?
Well, globalization.
Globalization.
Yeah.
Well, big question, because I think globalization is a very fetishized concept, because I think what it really expresses on an international level is something that's been going on throughout the history of capitalism, which is, capitalism has always existed as a world market. And, the idea that there's something qualitatively different on an economic level, I don't think stands up. We won't go into that.
Well, take for example...
I think the political problem of globalization was this idea that we had moved into a different stage, where the nation state didn't matter anymore. And it's that problem which I think is what we're, in a sense, suffering. Because I'm all in favor of movement. I'm all in favor of, I say, free trade, free movement of capital. I'm in favor of people being able to go on holidays in places. You know, when I left or voted or campaigned for leaving the European Union, I always said I was for Europe, but against the EU as an institution. I've got nothing against. I like traveling to EU, and other people like that, or traveling to Europe and so on. But the problem, what we've lost through that whole process, I think, has been that sense of a shared community. And that's a problem, not in a sort of an old-fashioned, oh, it's nice to know your neighbours and stuff, although it is. But I think without a shared community, democracy is meaningless. Unless you have, unless you have a shared sense of values, of history, of language, unless you have that coherence, then I think democracy becomes a pretty meaningless thing. And that's why I think it's very important not to be autarkic or isolationist or turn your back on the world. I think it is quite possible to be a robust supporter of one's nation and national interest and be not just consistent. It's necessary if you want to be a proper internationalist.
And Benedict, is AI going to basically undermine all of this? Like a lot of these conversations about the national interest, as you kind of alluded to. Where do you think that the artificial intelligence and the technology revolution over the next 10 years is going to shape these kinds of questions?
Well, maybe just a quick reflection on some of these points, and then I'll get into that, so it sort of doesn't divert so massively into super intelligence and what it actually means to be human. I think one of the things, actually I was at the American Ambassadors event on Monday night with the Wingfield House, the Independence Day thing, and the band that was playing was Take That, and I just thought, are we just stuck in a bit of a time warp on some of this? But I do think with a lot of our sort of representation in the sort of the public sphere and some of this is, when we looked at those sort of, I guess, those common spaces and questions, like it was when you had, a couple of newspapers dominating the discourse, four news channels. And I think some of that allowed you to have a lot more sort of a common lexicon and sort of common forms of debate. But I do actually think then the expansion, almost to your sort of previous point, where you can just engage with so much more greater variety of ideas, music artists. The biggest music artist is Bugs Bunny, a Puerto Rican guy now today, and it just shows you that you could probably be completely detached from what is actually big today, but because we don't have some of those common spaces. I think there's a lot of positives in that. I do agree that we have to think about how we sort of bound our common culture around things as well, but you often come to them incredibly bad solutions like national service. So I haven't seen many practical examples of where this actually happens in practice beyond the new elements like sports clubs, and marathons maybe is a bit too puritanical for me, but there are other ways. AI though, look, obviously the race to AI and to AGI. Number one, whichever nation achieves that ultimately or immediately becomes the most powerful nation in the world by a long way and can dictate the terms in different ways. And I do think that then, again, state power, security, all of those elements are profoundly changed. I do think there are other elements just on a sort of a basic social level, like we're going to see huge disruption across industries, and not in always the ways that we assume, because we had these debates on whether it's truck drivers a few years ago, but it probably looks like it's going to be lawyers and other bits which are just sort of which generative AI has opened up completely new elements, marketing, PR, etc. And I think we have to begin to think very, very quickly and very profoundly about what the shifting nature of society and economies will be, because it will get really weird, I think, in the next few years. I think there's Mark Warner in the audience today, and he sometimes says to me, just remember, if you get to AGI, all bets are off. And I think people can predict different courses of where society to go, but we could in the next 5-10 years just have this incredibly powerful technology which is much, much brighter than all of us. I mean, it's probably brighter than me already in many levels. And so we have to begin to prepare now, and that is the primary question. And then your institutions and how they can actually adapt and evolve to this changing world. Again, it's the primary question that you need to begin to think about and get ready, because I know what we'll have. We'll have a commentariat that often says, AI is all overhyped and it's not going to do anything, and then in 10 years' time they'll be writing columns saying Britain missed the wave on all of this and we should have been thinking much more deeply about it. Britain has a sort of a good, I mean, it's obviously brilliant on many levels, but it also has a brilliant capability at missing some of the big changes that are happening around the world and not thinking about how it begins to harness and understand and then ultimately utilize them for its own means.
Elisabeth.
I just wanted to link back to what you said, Yascha, about the difference between allowing people to express their opinions but not engaging in violence against our institutions. And I was reminded of the final sentence in Mephisto by Klaus Mann. I don't know how many people here have read it, but how many people here have read it, by the way? Yes, a few. And so, as you will remember, the final sentence is, "But I'm just an actor." And that is, I think, where we have ended up as liberal democracies, that we as citizens see ourselves as just citizens, companies see themselves as just companies, etc. And I think what this panel is about is do we have a responsibility beyond being just citizens? So as a mere citizen, yes, I do have the right to criticize public institutions and any institution and any aspect of society that I like, but don't I also have a responsibility not to contribute to the denigration of those institutions by criticizing them? And as a business leader, for example, do I not also have the responsibility to act in the national interest? And if we pursue life in a modern society on the basis that, oh, I'm just a citizen, I'm just an actor, I'm just a business leader, then we do end up with this atomized society. And so yeah. I think where we are heading, or at least should be heading, is a society where we have the right to act in particular ways as citizens, because we have freedom of speech and so forth, but we also have a moral obligation to think of ourselves as more than just a citizen.
I want to take it to the floor, but there's just a quick question I just wanted to ask, and anyone can pick up. Just bringing it broader from a geopolitical perspective, we now have, conflict in the Middle East, in Europe. There's been some discussion that there may well be conflict in East Asia very soon. What's people's sense about Britain's role in this? Because some people believe that this is, in some senses, imperial nostalgia, that Britain is really trying to have a prominent role, and it's just not that country anymore. And actually, we need to be thinking more about getting closer to the European Union. Others think actually we need to be strengthening our Atlanticist relationship, or even the Commonwealth countries, and so on and so forth. What's people's sense? I think you touched upon it, Phil, but I don't know if other panelists also have a sense of where Britain's role is in regards to in the world stage. What should it be projecting? Yascha?
Well, let me just say that on this point, I think Britain really does have to think in concert with other Western countries. Western in the political sense, which would include Japan and South Korea and other places. And I think that's just a fundamental question we have to ask in a time in which not just Russia is engaging in very dangerous adventures in foreign policy, but China clearly is now a systematic competitor. What it means to stand up for the basic values of that Western alliance without risking World War III. And I think some of the sort of points that you outlined earlier were very helpful on that, but to say that we clearly want to stand up for territorial integrity, but we clearly want to stand up for our ability to have free speech within our own countries, including free speech about places like China, which is threatened, that we need to maintain enough power in the international system to make sure that we actually will be able to have genuine democracy within our own borders. But not to think that in order to accomplish that, we somehow need to turn the whole world democratic, or engage in hopes of somehow being the cause of the CCP disappearing and China becoming a flowering global democracy, all of which would be wonderful, but does not seem to be on the cards. And so I think that conversation cannot be a merely British conversation. It has to be a conversation that is very much in concert with Britain's still European partners in the United States and other countries.
Yeah, just very quickly, anyone want to respond quickly?
Yeah. I mean, I think people sometimes say, Britain's a very small country, but I think there's a lot of smaller countries who, in a sense, punch above their weight. I mean, we talked yesterday about Singapore, talked about Sweden, you could talk about, Switzerland and stuff, countries, which are recognised, in the world. Now, they don't have, big armies that they're sending around to intervene in places, and that's a sort of a historical legacy of Britain. But I think that, when you review, there'll be a national security review presumably done after the election, and they'll come up with another, should we reprioritise a bit more in Europe given Ukraine's happened, and but we can't forget China, of course, so we have to have some, Asia-Pacific sort of perspective. I think all that is really just as much hot air as the whole idea of Britain being, a world leader in this, a world leader in that, a global power in that. Its ability to have a positive influence in the world, I think, will be based on two things. An ability at home to have a country that works, because I think if you're a laughing stock, you said, I think it was crummy was the word, but everybody knows Britain is broken, around the world, I think. They're like British people. I'm not saying that, they're completely contemptuous of British people, but a lot of people know that Britain does not work as a country at the moment. So first thing is that Britain should get its own act together and sort out its problems so it can have a decent infrastructure, a health system that works, all those basic public goods. That's what we should do. So the problem really begins at home. And on that basis, if you've got something which has got a certain amount of self-respect, then you can get back to good old-fashioned diplomacy, use your strength and your reputation to promote those sort of principles I talked about of national sovereignty, of freedom, and so on. And through that, try to prevent what we were talking about last night, this slide into a third world war.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Elisabeth, did you just quickly want to come back on something?
Yes, we have to mention the Houthis because they're...
the Houthis?
The Houthis, right. Yes, the Houthis. Because their campaign in the Red Sea is a very, very dramatic expression of of a global trend, which is the deterioration of the rules-based international order, and entities, governments and their proxies subverting the rules-based international order. And the question is, who are the defenders of the rules-based international order? And there, the UK plays a massive role, simply because there aren't that many defenders of the rules-based international order. So the ones that do exist are called upon often to try to restore order, and that's what we're seeing in the Red Sea. If we look at who is able to send naval vessels to the Red Sea, who has been able and is doing so, it's not many countries, and fewer countries still are able to participate in the strike coalition, so it's really just the UK and the US. If the UK were not there, this would be a task for the US alone, and that would not be healthy for the world. So the UK, yes, we can sort of put down the UK's abilities and sort of suggest that it's not working, but in many ways it is working well, including in international security, and that is a role that will continue to grow in importance because fewer and fewer countries are willing to abide by the rules, and they are even willing to openly violate rules, and that is a significant change compared to just 10 years ago.
Thank you. And Benedict, then we'll go to the floor.
All right, just a couple of quick points, which is number one, it is deeply in our national interest to invest in our defence and security capabilities in a much more profound way today, and upgrade our capabilities. You're seeing, so the Houthis is a good example, and Ukraine is another example of the changing nature of warfare. You're seeing increased capabilities of companies like Anduril as well, which are doing amazing things to redefine how we think about defence. And actually a lot of our defence is locked in a different form of conservatism with these massive primes, which are kind of ossified not able to adapt to both a sort of a software-enabled and new types of capabilities with drones and others, which are changing very, very, very quickly, and we're behind the curve on that, and we're very stuck in a sort of percentage of GDP expenditure debate rather than what are we trying to do with this and mission objectives. In terms of the UK's then role, is obviously we do need to then invest in this, and that's not necessarily for a sort of a more, interventionist approach abroad, but in Ukraine we have, played a strong role and have a lot of trust within that, that administration. I think, it is a form of international statecraft, beginning to think about what we could begin to do to sort of win the peace, so to speak. There, the UK could be a profound broker, as long as, the very difficult question that you can't make it look like Putin has won. But I do think that is something that will have to be resolved. Otherwise, what we first sort of started out from a lot of sides, where people were saying this is a sort of a 1 month, 6 month war, will continue for a long, long time. And I think the UK can play a big role on that. On Israel and Gaza, I think that is ultimately going to be an Arab solution. Post the Abraham Accords, you obviously saw Israel and Saudi Arabia and UAE beginning to broker a normalization of ties, which was a really good thing for the shifting geopolitics in the US and in the Middle East. And obviously the US is now becoming a lot sort of closer with the UAE and Saudi Arabia on lots of elements, but ultimately I think it will take one of the sort of the big players in the Middle East to step up and begin to broker that. I don't think the UK will have much sort of leeway in that if you really want to get the kind of the peace that you need in the longer term as well. But I think there's two things: invest in our national interest in defence and security, but also do think about international statecraft, because we have lost some of that over the years in profound ways.
Thank you. So we only have 15 minutes left, so sorry we went over a little bit in terms of our discussion, but I'm going to take a few questions at a time. Lots of hands up. I'm also particularly interested in people that might have thoughts about the climate change question and like what we should be doing there, but also there's some discussion about international law. I know there's a couple of people at the summit that are experts in international law as well, but open to all questions. Gentleman at the front.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. Chris Whitehouse, one of the outgoing fellows. Just picking up on the anecdote about Deutsche Bank in the 70s. I suppose to me that thing that flashes in my head as a Brit is, I can't remember which way around, British Leyland taking over British Rover, or the other way around, and driving both to the ground. So perhaps Mike Bird's point yesterday about how these things have costs, and are we, there are costs there. I suppose in terms of like aligning, corporate interests with national interests, China's the big, unspoken thing in the room, and so I was interested in your take, Benedict, about, if we want to build these like big world-beating companies, especially at like the frontier of tech, presumably that's going to require some reliance on China, or maybe not. And what are your thoughts on that? How do you align that?
Cool.
Make that alignment.
Thank you. We'll take next two questions, gentlemen.
Thanks. My name's Tony. I'm a West Ham fan and a citizen of nowhere until recently. Two questions for the panel, which I thought, by the way, was brilliant, in fact, gripping, really, really good. I don't think I've really heard an answer to the question, why does sovereignty matter to a state the size of ours in the environment you're describing? And secondly, if sovereignty does matter and national interest matters, do we have politicians who have the ability, in the widest sense of that term, to actually do anything about it? You might sense I'm a bit doubtful. And then just a couple of comments, if I may.
Sorry, just very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. All right, just one comment then. I agree fully that the state apparatus needs radical reform. I can't remember who said that. As someone that works extensively in the public sector, I think we don't have the culture, quality, structure, risk appetite to do anything in this sphere.
Thank you. Rachel, just there.
I'm just interested in understanding a bit better where the panel differs on what's the national interest. So if we look at some of the decisions of the last decade or so, the sale of arm, very high net migration, Brexit, net zero legislation, proposal for national service, are each of these in the national interest, against it, or irrelevant to it?
And we'll just take one more, and then gentleman in the blue there.
Slightly following on from Rachel, I thought was very interesting, but quite abstract at times. And so therefore, that means that you can get away with things like, we should support our strengths, but we should level up. And we should support the national interest, but we have to work within the rules-based order. So I would like 2 specific policies from each of you that are in the national interest that help define what you think the national interest is. Because otherwise you can end up just being a bit platitudinal, where you're like, we must work within the national order, but with our own interests in mind, etc., etc. And so I want to sort of cut through that and say 2 policies that sum up what you think the national interest should be.
Thank you. So we had a question about world-beating companies. I think that was for you, Benedict. What does sovereignty actually mean? And do we have the leaders that can enact that? And how did the panel differ? And some concrete policies that are in the national interest. So perhaps you want to start, Benedict.
And the question was also, are we going to be reliant on China to some degree? Yeah, I think in some places you will end up being reliant on China, and this is where I think the reality of globalization sometimes on the economic side, let's take climate tech as a big one. China is the biggest producer of solar panels. It basically owns 80% of lithium. You're beginning to see this already in the Euros. You're seeing BYD being advertised, which is a massive change, actually, if you think that Chinese cars are beginning to enter the European market. And I was in Stockholm last week, and Zika was there, and I think this is a big wave of consumer change that you will begin to see in climate and EVs, etc. Obviously, some of the response to that has already been put on tariffs and other sort of protectionist measures as a way to fight back. I mean, that only just slightly always stems the tide. In my experience, the same in controls of GPUs and chips, which is in some ways probably on balance the right thing to do, but at the same time it just massively incentivized China to go much harder in building the chip technology. And I know from others that have been going into China recently, they're seeing these sort of $40 billion fabs just pop up everywhere across the ecosystem. And China is not stupid at directing itself in towards national ambitions of these things, which will be the sort of the industries of the future. So I think there will be inevitably in some places where you are just going to have to work with them, but at the same time, this is why our competitiveness just matters in a really, really deep way. And I think, I look across the board, the sort of the easy ones to pick off right now are, sort of AI, biotech, where we have a lot of capabilities in the UK, but could do so much more if we unlocked the NHS data question, and that'd be one of my policies to begin to think about. And clean tech, where we've kind of just decided to do lots of sort of kind of restrictive targets and budgets, etc., when we should just been going gangbusters on developing the technologies as exports. And then I would add to that, then you're going to see a whole raft of other industries which we actually could have strong capabilities in, things like material science, superconductor. The fusion kind of ecosystem at Culham could be something that we should massively incentivize, and if we get that right, it's kind of like towards that risk appetite, massive high risk, high reward kind of approach that the state should begin to take on today at scale. So I think there's a lot that can be done. I think we're going to have to work with them to some degree on multiple issues, actually including AI safety, for example, where China will just have to be part of the discussion if we want to get this right.
Yeah. Phil,
okay.
two policies, and also I think the sovereignty question.
Yep, okay.
Quickly.
2 policies. First one, I would say, would be as a recent example, the wholehearted support for Ukraine against Putin. I think that was one of the, apart from getting Britain out of the European Union, I think that was one of Boris Johnson's strongest legacies, that he took a firm stand on that earlier than most, of seeing that what I would see as a brutal abrogation of self-determination, of national sovereignty, cannot be turned a blind eye to. And I think he has credit for all his problems. He deserves credit for being one of the first to take sides with Ukraine. So I think that is that was very much a decision in the British national interest, and so there's an element of having a strong, coherent, credible national military capability, or the production of armaments and so on, is obviously an important part. The second one, which would I'd say a second decision or second policy of national interest, was leaving the European Union. And why that was in the interest of the nation was because of the issue of sovereignty. So I can answer both things. It was not, for me, even though I've got an economic background, the decision to vote to leave or to campaign to leave the European Union had nothing to do with economics. It was entirely to do with sovereignty, because there was too many decisions being taken outside the people that we elect. And as I alluded to, in fact, there are many, many more ways in which the British national political class use being part of the European Union as a way of hiding from its own responsibility. So it was an excuse for not taking responsibility for serving the interests of the people within its territory.
Yeah.
And that's what sovereignty matters to me. One needs to have strong borders so you can have the basis of having a community in which people have broadly shared interests and can make decisions, whether directly like in a referendum or through representative democracy, to be able to realise their wishes.
Thank you. Quickly, Elisabeth and Yascha, because we want to take one more round of questions. Quickly.
Okay, so I'll do the two policies then. One, I think, is already underway and is quite successful, which is inbound and outbound. Well, inbound investment screening and outbound is beginning to happen. And why does that matter? Why is it in the national interest? Because it allows our companies to operate. No, I shouldn't say allows our companies to operate. It allows the country to operate more independently of countries on which we don't want to be overly dependent anymore. And it will be painful initially to block certain investments, and I think you mentioned ARM, but in the long run it will be beneficial, and will also be beneficial to not have our own companies invest as massively in China in particular, but that's farther off in the future. Then a second policy that I would like to see, so I would have said national service, but somebody who has worked on national service for a long time, but then it was put out as a hastily conceived election idea, and so I think that idea is gone for a little while. It's going to be hard to resurrect in a less frantic and moments in the UK debate, but I think a policy that I would like to see is information literacy training for everyone, considering the amount of information we consume and how utterly unprepared we are for how utterly unknowledgeable we are about what constitutes a fact and how to verify information. It is a miracle that we don't, that the public debate in the UK is still as relatively sane as it is. And but the problem of inaccuracies is not going to go away. And the government should not be assessing information accuracy, but the responsibility should be on citizens to assess and verify information for themselves, which is why we need information literacy training. Over.
Thank you. And Yascha, very quickly.
Yeah, two quick points. First is that we've thought about various forms of threat to our politicians actually pursuing the national interest rightly understood. And I think there's two slightly different accounts of what that threat consists in. One of them is that this is the elites, in formulation of David, who's here, David Goodhart, sort of being citizens of nowhere, really just not being connected to the nations in any kind of way, right? I think a different formulation, which is subtly but importantly different, is elites just being very far from the preferences of most of their citizens. I find the second of these formulations to be slightly more convincing. So I have a slightly crazy week. I came in from Korea yesterday evening, and I'm going on to Italy to a friend's wedding later today. Korea and Britain and Italy are vastly, vastly different places. And even when you interact with the elite in each of those countries, they are vastly different from each other. The one thing they have in common is that each of them are in various ways somewhat dislocated from the preferences of the average citizens in their countries. And so I actually worry less about the fact that the elites in this room in English society are somehow identical to the elites I know in America or identical to the elites I know in Italy, because they really aren't. It's that, all of us collectively will have divergent interests and divergent moral views from where a lot of voters are. And that, I think, is the bigger threat to actually putting into place the national interest rightly understood. To answer briefly the question about two public policies, I would say that I also have some skepticism about certain forms of industrial policy. I think it's good to have certain forms of industrial policy. It's certainly good to worry about key things being produced in China and so on. But I think there is a bad form of industrial policy which is very prominent in a lot of European politics for a long time, which was, getting banks to buy up struggling companies in ways that just sustained, deeply economically inefficient manufacturing and, ultimately just delayed the pain in ways that wasn't particularly helpful to countries being economically thriving. So I think that is actually where something looks like it's the national interest, but it's not. Something where I think the national interest is compatible with something that may not look like a liberal position, but I think is on immigration, which is that I do think that there is a national interest in controlling a country's borders. I think there's a national interest in prioritizing high-skilled immigration over low-skilled immigration. My read of the performance of various countries is that it doesn't matter what part of the world immigrants come from, it doesn't matter what their religion is, it certainly doesn't matter what their skin color is, but the level of qualification and talent they have coming in does matter for integration and success of a multicultural society, or I don't like the term actually, of a diverse society. And so I think controlling borders, while not necessarily being against all forms of migration, in fact perhaps championing reasonable levels of migration, but ones where the state selects immigrants for their likelihood of integrating and for what they can contribute, is absolutely compatible with a national interest, even from a liberal point of view.
Thank you. Okay, we only have 1 minute left, so I think if we can have 10-second points, I'm going to cut you off if you're going over 10 seconds, but William Atkinson, 10 seconds.
Well, I think I'm just pushing back on that, because we've especially seen in this country that an increasing, especially since October 7th, that an increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural society, growing demographics, you feel they aren't part of the same national interest as the rest of the country as a whole, and have more interest in diaspora politics than politics of the regions of the country, which may be against other parts of the world, which might be against the foreign policy of the substantial government. So I just wondered what the panel thinks of how you're supposed to create a sense of cohesive nation in increasingly multiracial, multi-ethnic societies. It strikes me that that's something we're struggling to at the moment, in which they need to become more difficult based on demographic trends. Interesting.
There are lots of native Brits that focus on politics in Gaza and things like that as well. So I think there is that. David.
Really, just to support Yascha's point, a really good example, I think, of the gap between political class opinion and ordinary person opinion that's kind of gone beneath the radar is the decision of the Tory government last year to spend, at a time of very great constraint on public spending, £4 billion on extending childcare to infants as young as 9 months. This was universally greeted positively in the media. The people that will benefit most from this are professional to full-time working parent households. The number of people in Britain, according to British social attitude surveys, who think that this is a good thing is 9%. Less than 10% of the public think that the ideal form of raising children is having 2 full-time working parents. Completely disappeared beneath the radar. There's a huge gap, and this is just one example of so many.
Thank you. We'll just take one more comment from the floor. Cool. Quickly.
For people who've been talking a lot about the value for roots, how many of you guys live within a 15-minute drive of your mother? And do you guys regularly attend one of these weekly institutions like church, like a working man's club? Basically, to me, there's a lot of disingenuousness from people who talk about these things, being like, hey, somewheres are great, I'm just glad I'm not one of them. So I'm curious what you guys' views on that are.
Yeah. So 30 seconds from each panelist. And we also have an unconference, guys, so feel free to continue those sessions there. But Yascha, do you want to start? 30 seconds.
I think that's a great point at the end. I would just say that goes back to what I was saying about different forms of liberalism. One freedom that liberalism allows for people is to be self-actualizing, autonomy-maximizing kind of person who prioritizes their career over other kinds of things. And that's perfectly fine. We need some of those people in society. I do think it's important to bear in mind that that is not how most people live, and that our institutions shouldn't favor that set of people over everybody else.
Yeah, thank you. Short and sweet. Elisabeth?
I'll take the question from the young man who asked about groups that don't feel part of the community. Latvia has a really good initiative that I think other countries could learn from, which is they have national security training for all teenagers, and you can say, that is exaggerating the threat, and it's not necessary. Well, they have rolled it out now over the past few years. So now all senior secondary school students in the last 2 years have a national security training. It includes learning how to read a map, not using Google Maps, obviously, learning about the threats facing Latvia, and actually, I think getting that different perspective, learning about the threats that face your country is a useful antidote to thinking about yourself as somehow just one part of your country, not representing your country. And it has turned out actually to be quite useful in integrating ethnic Russians into thinking about them, into Latvian society, which wasn't the case before. So I've gone beyond 10 seconds.
Thank you. 10 seconds.
Well, I'll just leave with a question for you to think about, which is that Elisabeth talked about the national interest being to defend the rules-based international order. And I ask you to think about that, because to me, the rules-based international order is a euphemism for the US-led settlement, which ended the Second World War, which was relevant at that time. It reflected the balance of powers then. But we are living in a world which is quantitatively and qualitatively different, right? There's a big mismatch between economics and politics in terms of national weights, and I would argue that for us to try and retain the past is not in Britain's national interest. Britain should be, I think you should think about it, trying to be part of creating a new international settlement which recognises that the world is very, very different today than it was in 1945.
Thank you. And Benedict?
I'll answer the gentleman in the moustache as the provocation at the end. So I live very close to my mother, but she wishes I lived closer.
Thank you so much. We now have a 25-minute break for tea and coffee, and it's just in the hall there, so please come back very soon after the next session. Thank you.